Whenever we hear the words North Pole or South Pole, a very typical image comes to mind. An endless white landscape, white ground, white mountains, and even the sky looks pale because of thick clouds. Snow and ice everywhere. Temperatures way below zero. So in our minds, both poles are pretty much the same. Just snow and ice, right? But is that really true? Welcome, everyone. Today we're answering the question, what's the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole? And before we get started, if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. So wait, surprisingly, the North and South Poles are completely different places. Sure, they both have snow and ice, but there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of other differences. For example, one of them is actually a huge frozen ocean, while the other is a giant landmass. One of them has human and animal life around it, while the other has almost none. One of them has the ozone hole above it, the other doesn't. And finally, there's a major difference in their temperatures. One is way colder than the other. Let's rewind for a second. The first recorded attempt to reach the North Pole was back in the 19th century, led by British explorer William Parry in 1827. Then exploration efforts kind of slowed down until American explorer Ralph Plaisted reached it again in 1968 using snowmobiles. A year later, British explorer Wally Herbert led another expedition there. On the other hand, the South Pole story started a bit later. European and American explorers tried for years to reach it, beginning with Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and ending with British captain Robert Falcon Scott. Scott and his team managed to get within 600 kilometers of the South Pole, but had to turn back due to harsh weather and a lack of supplies. But Scott wasn't about to give up. After several failed attempts, he finally made it to the South Pole in 1911. Tragically, though, he and his team died on the return trip because of food shortages and freezing temperatures. These historic missions taught us a lot, including how different the North and South Poles truly are, and that it's not just about snow and ice. Let's start with a fun fact about wildlife. If I asked you to name two animals you'd find at the poles, you'd probably say polar bears and penguins, right? Most people imagine them living together, peacefully fishing and hanging out in the snow. But guess what? That's a total myth. Polar bears and penguins have never met in the wild. They actually live on completely different sides of the planet. Penguins live in the South Pole, polar bears live in the North Pole, and are the largest land predators in their environment. If they shared the same habitat, penguins wouldn't stand a chance. Because let's be honest, penguins can't fly or run from a hungry polar bear. So if you ever see a cartoon or a movie showing polar bears and penguins as best friends, just remember, they're lying to you. Now, one of the easiest ways to tell the two poles apart is by looking at the landscape. The North Pole is basically a frozen ocean surrounded by land. The South Pole is a huge continent completely surrounded by ocean. That's why the South Pole is one of the planet's 7 continents called Antarctica, while the North Pole isn't considered a continent because there's no actual land there, just floating ice. Now, yes, both places have ice, but their temperatures aren't even close. The South Pole is way colder than the North Pole. That's because the South Pole sits at an elevation of about 3,000 meters above sea level. And as we all learned in school, the higher you go, the colder it gets. Plus, Antarctica has thick layers of ice, hundreds of meters deep, and massive mountain ranges. Meanwhile, the North Pole doesn't have mountains or thick glaciers. It's basically floating ice at sea level. Temperature-wise, South Pole, as cold as minus 89 degrees Celsius, and in warm weather, about minus 12 degrees Celsius. North Pole, typically around minus 40 degrees Celsius, and in warmer weather, around minus 5 degrees Celsius. Snowfall is also different. The South Pole gets heavy, consistent snow. The North Pole? Not so much. Snow falls there rarely. Because of these reasons, life thrives much more in the North Pole than the South. In the North, indigenous communities like the Inuit live and survive in these extreme conditions. There's also plant life, fish, birds, and various land animals. But the South Pole has none of that. Now you might be wondering, Are the poles actually important, or are they just giant ice boxes keeping the planet cool? In fact, both poles play a huge role in maintaining Earth's climate. They act like planetary air conditioners, balancing temperatures and making sure heat is distributed evenly around the globe. But because of global warming, ice is melting faster in both poles, causing noticeable climate shifts all over the world. Lastly, beyond climate, the North Pole has serious economic value. Even though no country technically owns it, several nations have territory bordering it, including Russia, Canada, Norway, the United States, and Denmark. Why do they care about a frozen wasteland? Not for the ice, but for what's underneath. The North Pole is believed to hold over 62 trillion cubic meters of natural gas and about 10 billion tons of oil. For a country like Russia, this is huge. About 11% of its national income comes from the Arctic region. It produces 90% of its nickel and cobalt, 60% of its copper, and 96% of its platinum from this area. Around 22% of Russia's exports originate from the Arctic. That's why there's a constant political struggle between countries like Russia and the US over rights and resources there, even though international treaties try to regulate Arctic claims. So in the end, the North and South Poles aren't just icy, empty places. Each has its own unique environment, wildlife, climate, and geopolitical importance. And that's your answer to what's the difference between the North and South Pole. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss our next video. And hey, if there's a random question that keeps you up at night, drop it in the comments. We might answer it in an upcoming video. See you next time. Goodbye.